Hello, algebraists. This is Debbie, and today we are completing the square. Completing the square can be a little bit tricky, but just like anything, with practice, you really do get perfect at it. So there are a lot of steps to solving a problem by completing the square. The first one is to move the constant term to the right side of the equation. And I think what I'm going to do is go through these steps and work them through this equation as we do. So the first thing I'm going to do is add 18 to both sides of this equation. That's the constant term. It doesn't have a variable part. And so now what we have is x squared minus 7x. I'm going to leave room, and that gives us 18. I am going to put a plus blank on both sides of the equation. This reminds me that whatever I do to one side of the equation, I have to do to the other side, because remember, algebra is fair. All right, the next thing that we're going to do is take the middle term, b. We are going to half it, really is negative, and then so the steps are half it, square it. I chose a kind of difficult one to start with. Typically, when you half this middle term, you really just get a number. Hopefully your b term will be even. But in this case, we're not that lucky. So we're going to half it. We're going to square it. If we square this, we square the numerator and square the denominator. I am going to add, step 3, add this new term to both sides of the equation. I'm going to add 49/4 to the left side of the equation and 49/4 to the right side of the equation. So let me write a little neater what we've got so far. We've got x squared minus 7x plus 49/4. That's equal to 18 over 1 plus 49/4. Okay. The left side of the equation is going to be a perfect square. This guy right here is a perfect square. I'm going to write it as this. First of all, it's x, the square root of this. It's this same sign. This is minus, so I'm going to make it minus. And it is going to be either half of the middle term or the square root of the last term. And guess what? Those are always going to be equal if it's going to be a perfect square. Half of 7 is 7 halves. The square root of 49/4 is 7 halves. Those are the same thing. Now let's do the right side. I need a common denominator. 18 over 1, I'm going to multiply by 4 over 4. That, I believe, gives me 72 over 4. So I've got 72 over 4 plus, I'm going to add these together as long as we got them here, 72/4 plus 49/4. Let's see, that's 121 over 4. All right, let's review. We started with this equation. We moved the constant term to the right side of the equation. That's step 1 right here. Step 2 was we took our b middle term, we halved it and squared it. Half of 7 is 7 halves. 7 halves squared is 49 over 4. We added this new term to both sides of the equation, this side and this side. We simplified it. What happens now is this left side is a perfect square. So we created that perfect square. It's always x, or whatever the variable it is. It's either half of the b term or the square root of the c term, which is the same thing that goes in this position. All right, now we've got an equation. This is messy, I'm going to rewrite it. 121 over 4. In the previous sections, we actually solved quadratic equations using something called the square root property, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. We are going to take the square root of the left side and the square root of the right side, being very careful to remember my plus or minus. The square root and the squared are what we call inverse properties, operations. So what I really have is just x minus 7/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 121 is 11. The square root of 4 is 2. Don't be alarmed, because this particular problem, yeah, it's the hardest problem in the homework, but it was a great example of how to do this. I'm not quite finished yet. This other part should look very familiar. If it doesn't, it means you haven't done enough of the previous section's homework. So we have x minus 7/2 equals negative 11/2. And over here we have x minus 7/2 equals plus 11/2. I'm going to add 7/2 to both sides. And if I do that, I get x equals, this is negative 4/2, so that means x equals negative 2. Likewise, I'm going to add 7/2 to both sides here. If I do that, I get x equals 18/2, which is 9. Remember, when you get answers doing these problems, I can always check my work. If I were to check my work using x equals negative 2, I would get, I'm going back to this equation and plug it in. I get negative 2 squared is 4. Negative 7 times negative 2 is plus 14 minus 18. Looky there, that does equal 0. I get 0 equals 0. X equals negative 2 checks. If I check it using 9 squared is 81, minus 7 times 9 is 63, minus 18, by golly gosh, it's 0. So I get 0 equals 0 there, and my work checks. Let's do one more example. Now in this particular example, I need to warn you of something. Completing the square only works when my first term is just plain old x squared. So in order to get that to be the case, I'm going to divide this entire equation, each piece, by negative 2. That is the only way that this x squared term will have a coefficient of just plain old 1. So what I have is x squared plus 2x minus 80. That's equal to 0. Now I have to go back to my steps. Step 1, move the constant term to the right side. If I move the constant term to the right side, this gives me x squared plus 2x equals 81. I'm going to put a blank on both sides because I know I'm going to complete the square. I take this term I half it. What is half of 2? 1. The next step is to square it. Half it, square it. 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. This gives me x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals, I'm sorry, that's 80. What am I doing? Oh my gosh, I could see what was coming. Pardon me, you were like, Debbie doesn't know division. Oops, that's 80 plus 80. I'm catching up. There we go, 80. Sorry about that. All right. So finally, 80 plus 1, I added 1 to both sides. I get 81. This is a perfect square. It's an x. Since this is positive, plus sign, this is positive, this term is either going to be half of b, half of 2, or the square root of 1. 1. From here, I take the square root of both sides, and here I can't forget my plus or minus. I like this one better because it doesn't involve a gnarly fraction. Square root squared means I just have x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 81 is 9. From here, I break it up into my two equations. X plus 1 equals negative 9, and x plus 1 equals positive 9. I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides here. That gives me x. Okay. That was rude. Sorry. Uh-oh. Where is it? There it is. Got to get back to our example. Can't lose all that work. There we go. This gives me x equals negative 10. And over here, if I subtract 1 from both sides, I get x equals 8. If you have questions, let me know. I'll give you some video responses.